Hello, my name is Scott Weaver. I'm the Vice President of Pharmacy for the PRS Latanzio Consulting Group, with experience in over 200 pharmacy transfers and openings nationwide. I'm here to review the key points to help ensure a smooth pharmacy ownership transfer for both the seller and the buyer. The topics we are going to review include, first, the two types of sale, asset sale and stock sale. Secondly, the processes and procedures for the buyer to properly license the pharmacy. And finally, the processes and procedures for the seller to transfer the business and terminate all of his or her licenses and third-party insurance agreements. In all pharmacy transition, the goal is to facilitate a smooth transfer of ownership for both buyer and seller. And the key is to avoid an interruption in third-party billing and obtaining all required federal and state licenses. So, let's get started. The two different types of pharmacy purchases are asset sale or stock sale. So what is the difference? Well, in general, in an asset sale, the seller retains possession of the corporation or LLC, and the buyer purchases individual assets to the company, such as prescription files, equipment, inventory, fixtures, goodwill, etc., and assumes no liabilities. While in a stock sale, buyer purchases the seller's share of the corporation's stock directly, thus obtaining ownership of the seller's corporation along with all liabilities. A CPA and lawyer are the best qualified to offer guidance on which type of sale is best for your ownership transfer. Let's assume that the mutual non-disclosure agreement, the verbally agreed upon selling price, and the letter of intent are completed. It is now time to prepare the asset purchase agreement. Obviously, legal counsel is required to create the agreement. But what are the pharmacy-specific items that need to be included to transition smoothly to the buyer? First, to allow the continuation of the seller's existing state and federal licenses until the buyer obtains his or her own. Second, use of the seller's provider ID numbers. Third, you must have a power of attorney to govern the ordering and transfer of controlled drugs, as well as the temporary use of the seller's registration certificate. Fourth, an additional power of attorney is required to allow utilization of the seller's provider numbers and for the forwarding of reimbursements until the buyer is enrolled in all third-party plans. Note, this does not include Medicare Part B, which we will discuss later. Fifth, early termination of the relationships with any of these entities by the seller could have a negative effect on the transition. And lastly, buyer and seller must determine the parameters included, such as price formula, accepted expiration dating, an inventory company, and which party is responsible for payment. As discussed earlier, as part of the asset sale, the buyer must obtain all federal and state licenses and third-party enrollment under their corporation or LLC, as opposed to a stock sale, where all licenses and insurance contracts remain with the purchase corporation obtained by the buyer. However, the buyer still has a responsibility for examining state pharmacy requirements and DEA requirements on stockholder changes and notification procedures for private insurance payers, state Medicaid, and Medicare. Now let's discuss the buyer licensing timelines. Although you are working under the POA that was put in place to facilitate the asset purchase agreement, you're aware as a buyer that the responsibility of obtaining all federal and state licenses, as well as third-party insurance agreements, falls solely on you. These steps need to take place in this particular order. First, obtain the state pharmacy permit. Then, the state-controlled drug registration, if applicable in your state. Once these two are received, apply for your DEA registration certificate. After all three are completed, then the NCPDP, MPI provider ID numbers. And finally, only after obtaining the NCPDP, MPI, can the buyer begin enrolling with all the third-party insurance plans. The timelines for receiving each license vary from state to state. What does the seller need to do? As a seller, you will have a responsibility to terminate all licenses and third-party agreements after the buyer has obtained all of his or her licenses. Change of ownership application completed by the buyer will take care of this. Likewise, buyer's enrollment will void seller's registration. Once buyer obtains their certificates, there are specific procedures and notifications that must be followed to terminate the registration certificate and conduct the final controlled drug inventory. Visit their website to get the process on terminating your provider ID. The cancellation of your PSAO will terminate private payers as well as other individual third-party plans. View your state's required procedures. Immediately upon the closing of the sale, you must notify the National Supplier Clearinghouse. Why? It is illegal to file Medicare claims under another provider's Medicare provider number. As a pharmacy owner, the sale of your pharmacy is one of the most important things you will ever do. And as a buyer, the thrill of pharmacy ownership could be a dream come true. However, many pharmacists, whether a buyer or a seller, have never actually gone through all the necessary steps of this potentially complicated process. But by being prepared, reaching out to the various experienced professionals, addressing topics in the asset or stock sale, and understanding licensing and third-party enrollment timelines, you can ensure a smooth pharmacy ownership transition. Good luck.